So these are the 7 secret patterns View consultants don't want you to know. I've heard I have about 30 minutes until the viewerati finds me. They've located me, so I'm going to try to share as many secrets as I can with you. In the meantime, I figure they can't silence all of us. To tell you a little bit about me, this is me at the first ViewConf in Poland.
Pull this one out of the mix.
Right here. As you can see, I'm the only one looking at the wrong camera, which probably says a lot about me. Eduardo over here is looking at just nothing, like he's in like the album of a rock album, some kind of pop album or rock album or something, which is way cooler. I'm just doing something that is just slightly wrong, but not wrong enough to be cool. And what I do, I'm a consultant, and I also am on the core team and do a lot of work on the documentation especially, and also tooling to make developers' lives easier. One of my personal philosophies is that if you're not trying to make yourself redundant, you're not really serving. And so I try to make it so that other educational materials and my consulting work is as in little demand as possible. And the effect is that allows me to do more interesting things instead of solving the same problems over and over again. And I'm an educator by trade, similar to Jen Looper, who is a language teacher. I was formerly a German teacher. She was formerly a French teacher. And I also speak some Dutch, and I can confirm that the last time I heard her give that talk, her Dutch was better. So I've divided the secrets into 3 different categories: productivity boosts, radical tweaks, and unlocked possibilities. I'm trying to keep with the clickbait theme. And I want you to know there's going to be a lot of code, but there's no need to take notes. All the slides will be available afterwards. I'm going to show you a link. And you'll have plenty of time to look at it. And I'll also be available all day today if you want to ask me questions. So productivity boost number 1, smarter watchers. How many people have used a pattern like this in your app where you're calling some method uncreated, and then you're also watching some kind of data property or computed property, and then recalling that method when that changes? Raise your hands if you've used that in your apps before. Yeah, quite a few people. And it feels a little bit redundant. And actually, it can create bugs, too, because you might decide that when this property changes, and also at the beginning, you want to do something a little bit different. And then you have to change it in 2 places instead of just 1. So one optimization that you can make is to actually make the value of the watcher a string instead of a function. You can use a string that contains the name of the method that you want to call. The second optimization I want to show you is making the value an object so that the handler is either the function or a string containing the name of the method. And you can use the immediate true option to say that as soon as this watcher is registered, you'll also run the handler. And now, whenever we want this behavior to happen uncreated, and also whenever something changes, we can do it in one place, rather than having that spread out. And it's also a little bit cleaner. It's a little bit more organized. And a lot of people don't know about this. This is in the docs, but like a lot of things, we update the docs all the time. We're constantly improving them. And if you've read the entire docs, if you don't completely reread them every week, it's very possible to miss some new things where we've covered something in a little bit more detail than we did before. Or if you covered something, or if you, let's see. I'm just going to skip that. I had something else I was going to say and I forgot. Productivity boost number 2, component registration. So how many people have seen something like this in their apps, where they're importing a bunch of components, oftentimes just so that they can use a little bitty template? How many people have used this? Again, raise your hands. Beautiful. Quite a few people. Yeah, and it's kind of annoying, isn't it? We want to keep our applications modular, but there are some components like buttons, icons, inputs that we're sometimes using all over the place. And it's not so nice to have to bring all that boilerplate across every component. So there's one tip I'd like to show you. With component registration, you can actually automatically register some components. So in an application using Webpack, Webpack has a feature called require context. And with require context, you can specify a folder and also a regex, a regular expression, containing the pattern of files that you want to require. So this is all the .view files that start with base hyphen. So these are all our base components. And this is something I like to do with components that I'm using all over the place, and they're often pretty generic, and maybe just even add some styles that's specific to our app. And in require component here, we're going through and we're getting the component config, we're getting the Pascal case name of the component, and then we register it with view.component, which globally registers a component, using the component name, and then component config.default or component config. And some people might be wondering now, why do we have component config.default or component config? And for this, I actually want to see hands for the people who already know why I'm doing this, why I have that. I think I see maybe 5 or something, and the lights are bright. One of them is probably Sean Larkin. So the way that these applications often work in Webpack is that when you export default, that object is actually added to a default property, which is automatically handled for you by import. But if you don't export default, like let's say, for example, you only have a template in your component, then your component options will just be at component config. So this is something that handles both of those cases. And I often like to keep this code, maybe sometimes in source main.js, the entry file for your app, but you have to have it before you actually start your Vue application with new Vue. And also, I sometimes like to keep that in a _globals file inside of my components directory, and then I can import that into my entry file. So now, with this trick, all this boilerplate is removed, and we can just do this in our templates. It's much cleaner, and it makes me much more productive. I don't recommend doing that with all your components, though, because with non-base components, components that are a little bit more niche, if you stop using them, they'll still be included in your app, which you usually don't want. The third tip is module registration. This is very similar to the one we just saw. Again, we're reducing some boilerplate. So here we have import auth from modules auth, import post from modules post, import comments, et cetera, and then we have to list all those modules in our store. How many people who are using Vuex have seen this kind of pattern, have used this kind of pattern in their apps? Again, quite a few, and it's also a little bit annoying. Every time you create a new module, you have to go back here, add that import, and then add that entry to modules. It's tedious. So here's how we can use, once again, require context to solve this problem. This is what I like to put in an index.js file inside of my modules folder. And as you can see, I'm just requiring all the JS files, going through just like we did before with components. I am ignoring the index.js file because we don't want it to require itself. And then I'm getting the module name, then I'm registering the module. And there's one more trick I often like to do while I'm here that you can, because we're doing this, it's made possible. I often like to namespace my component, but by default, components, or Vuex, I like to namespace my modules, but by default, modules are not namespaced. So here, I can set new defaults. If I want all of my modules to be namespaced by default, I can add that here, and it'll be overridden if the module specifies a value for the namespace property. Otherwise, it'll always be namespace. It's very useful. This can be not only a way to save time, but also to establish best practices for your team. So now instead of all this, we've shortened this to this 4 lines of code, and we'll probably never have to update the store again in our application, which is really nice. It'll just work. And whenever we add a new module, it'll be pulled in automatically. So those are the productivity boosts. Now I'm going to some radical tweaks. These are some things that where you can make a little change, and then it'll make a big impact. Radical tweak number 1, lazy loaded routes. So in a lot of applications that have authentication and maybe have different kinds of users, you might sometimes have parts of the application that only some users are using. So I've had cases where only 3% of users are admins, and they have to access an admin dashboard. And there are a lot of components underneath the admin dashboard that are only used in the admin dashboard. But by default, if you do something like this, every user has to download the admin dashboard in case they are an admin, which is kind of inefficient. If it's not necessary, it'd be nice if most users could download a smaller bundle. Fortunately, there's a really small change that we can make to lazy load this route. That's it. In Webpack, you can replace component with a function that returns a dynamic import. And now, only when a user goes to that route will they download the code for this component and any subcomponents that are used only in the admin dashboard, which is really nice. It's an easy boost to user experience, and it's actually shorter. Now, you might not want to do this with all your components, because otherwise there could be a little bit, or all your view components, because otherwise there could be a little bit more time in between page loads, which might not be optimal. And you probably, in many cases, wouldn't save that much from your bundle by splitting it up further and further. Radical tweak number 2, transparent wrappers. This is one of the favorite tweaks that I show people. Sometimes I show them, and I hope this doesn't happen here, maybe I should have had it at the end, where people just want me to stop teaching them anything else and start implementing this in their apps right away. So here's an input. This is a base input component. This is how it might often start. I'm just assigning a value from a value prop, and then setting up an input to emit an input with event target.value so that this component will work with vModel. Unfortunately, sometimes I'll be doing something like this. I'll listen for something else that I haven't explicitly put in here, like an input. I can listen for an input here. But if I want to listen for a focus event, Vue's custom events works differently from native DOM events. So if I want to listen to a native DOM event, I have to say focus.native on a component. And that will listen to the root element on a component. And this is fine right now. This works. But then what happens when I refactor? Now I've added a label wrapping this input, and the root element of the component is no longer that input. So this is actually broken, and broken in a subtle way. We're not going to get an error or anything. It'll just listen for the focus event on the label instead of the input, so we won't get the same behavior that we want. So the way to solve this is to define a computed property. In this case, I'm calling it listeners, which will return an object. I'm adding all of the listeners using $listeners. That contains an object of all of the listeners passed to the component from the parent. And then, once again, I'm overriding input so that it works with vModel. And then here on the left, you'll see I'm using Vion's object syntax to bind all the listeners at once to this component. So now, instead of focus.native, I can simplify just to focus, do something. And this component will now work exactly the same as a normal input element would, at least in terms of events. There's still a problem. What happens when we do something like this? I've added a placeholder here, but this placeholder will be added to the label, because by default, attributes that are not defined as props will be added to the root element in view. And a placeholder on label, to my knowledge, probably doesn't do anything, and it certainly won't do what we want. Now, to fix this, we can add the inherit attrs false option to our component configuration, and then we can use vbinds object syntax to bind all the attrs with $attrs. Again, this is an object of all the attributes that are not defined as props that are passed to the component. So now the label will not inherit attributes automatically, but instead we're explicitly passing those attributes to the input where it belongs. And now we have fully transparent wrappers. This base input component works exactly like a normal input element. It's just like a superpowered one. And you never have to worry about, as you're using it, the implementation details of that component. You never have to think about, oh, what's the root element? You never have to think about what events you have defined. And I've seen in component libraries like thousands of line-long component definitions, because they're defining every single possible attribute that you might want to pass in every single event that they might want to listen to, and it becomes a real mess. And you can take those thousands of line components and narrow them down to maybe 30 lines, and it's much cleaner, and it always works, and there are no edge cases. It's beautiful. So those are my radical tweaks. Now on to unlocked possibilities. These are things that allow you to do something you might not have realized you could do before. So single root components. How many people have seen this error in their apps? Yeah? My hand is up too, because I still face it all the time. I think I wrote a lot of the warnings to warn you about these things, so I should really know better. But sometimes I forget. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I already have that. And then what do you do to fix it? You just like wrap it in another div. And it's kind of annoying. At least Vue gives you a nice warning. But sometimes there are patterns where this limitation doesn't work well. So for example, if I have this navbar component, and I have these navbar routes that I want to render, and I have a bunch of different groups. These are persistent nav routes, the ones that are always showing, just the ones that are logged in, navbar routes, logged out nav routes. This is very common. I use this kind of pattern in almost every application that will have some kind of authentication. There's an issue. When we write a template like this, sure, it looks like there's only one root element, the li, but we're actually rendering an array of elements with v4. So Vue will once again yell at us with that error. Unfortunately, in this case, we can't just wrap it in a div, because an li has to exist within a UL, and within a UL, you're not allowed to have a div as a direct child. So it would actually create invalid HTML. So you might be tempted at this point to just, okay, I guess we'll refactor this some other way, and we won't have this nice navbar routes component. I'm going to show you a way to do it, hinted at last night at the panel, using a functional component. A functional component, when using a render function, can actually return an array of elements. So in this case, we're returning an array of LIs, but Vue won't yell at us, because this functional component will actually render in its parent context. And the parent still only returns one root element. So now we can use multi-root components in some cases. Unlocked possibility number 2. This is building on the previous one. You might recognize this demo, which I shamelessly stole from Rachel Neighbors. I actually tried to make my own curtains, and they look terrible, so I figured I'll just steal her curtains. Her curtains were much nicer. So she had this great animation at the beginning of her talk where these curtains animated out. And looking at the source code, there are 3 different curtain elements or components that she's using that she wants to transition all at once. And when she was developing this, she actually talked to me, and she mentioned, like, do I have to just have like a VF on every single curtain? That's kind of annoying. And I agreed. I said, it is kind of annoying. And she says, is there a way to not do that? And I thought for a second, and then I realized, okay, yeah, maybe there is. I'm going to show you how to create a theater curtains component that you can just pass whether the curtains could be shown using, again, a functional component. Because we can return multiple root elements, we can actually say, if props.show, if we're going to show it, then we render these theater curtains. And once again, because they're evaluated in their parent context, they render as if they each have their own individual VIFs, and the transitions work perfectly. And this is a convenience when it's only 3 components. When you have thousands of components, or even just a couple dozen, and I've been in that situation sometimes, this is a much cleaner approach and a much more stable approach. It's much less brittle. It's less likely to break because you're not going to accidentally miss a VF somewhere or forget to change one of those. So those are all of the 7 secrets. If you can't get enough, you can check out more at Vue Enterprise Boilerplate. This is a repo where I show off some of these patterns and many more. And also, I have some documentation roadmap stuff listed on my Patreon, which I mentioned yesterday. So if you want to see some of the big projects that I'm working on, you can go to patreon.com/ChrisViewFritz. And as I get more patrons, I'll get more and more time to work on these things to make people's lives easier. And I'm really excited about doing that because it's the thing I like doing the most. And I also want to announce the first big project that I list on there has already been done. Sarah Drasner and I teamed up to completely reorganize and rewrite the components page, and we just published that earlier this week. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. We think it's a lot better than it used to be. More examples, better examples, more detailed explanations. We think you'll like it a lot. And I also want to thank, I'll let you give me applause later. I also want to thank Cameron Adams, which is my Vusionary level sponsor, who did a huge part in making it possible for me to do this work. It was really great. And it did take a lot of work. I often rewrite something 20 times before I'm actually happy with it, which is one of the reasons why the docs are the quality that they are. And that does take a lot of time. So you can see these slides at github.com/ChrisVFritz/7secretpatterns. And you can find me at ChrisVFritz pretty much everywhere online that I am. And for a limited time only, I also exist in the real world. And I would love to hear from you if there's anything else that, any other secret patterns that you've discovered that you want to tell me about, or if there's something that you haven't learned, you need to come up with me. You need to come up to me and tell me that so that I can teach you something, because I refuse to let you walk away from this conference, and especially my talk, not having learned something. And that's it. Oh. We can keep doing it. Oh, I also want to give a special thanks to Greg and Sarah, who inspired me to add some animations to my talk. I was reviewing some of Greg's stuff before while I was working on my slides, and was feeling like they were definitely inadequate. And then I learned how to use Magic Moving Keynote.
All right, let's give Chris a big round of applause.